I lead the development of what we call a climate transition office in Gothenburg, with clearly the road to speed up the transition. What I like to take my starting point, though, is an old saying in Gothenburg, which goes like this, that we in Gothenburg do not write poetry, we write invoices. And to paraphrase that for today, one may say that in Gothenburg, we do not talk systems innovation. We are busy digging, building, and rewiring. And I'm saying this not at all to downplay the value of innovation. It's hugely important, and many great things have been said about it during these days. But at the same time, we must not get stuck there. And in a sense, we now need to move rapidly from the poetry to the invoices in that Gothenburgian sense. Because I think what COP26 quite unambiguously showed is that we now have the commitments we need globally and nationally. And the challenge ahead now is not to make additional commitments, but to rapidly produce the practical roadmaps that will ensure that we get there. And this involves financing structures, but also organizational capacity, accountability structures, and of course, the ability to mobilize politically. But in doing this, we also need to take to heart how fundamental shift we are talking about, and thus also be prepared to learn to manage what I think is a new level of risk-taking that will inevitably follow in the wake of this transition. But let me go back and say something about Gothenburg to root this in the practical challenges. This old saying I mentioned, we write invoices, not poetry, of course, reflects the history of the city. Built in the 1600s as essentially a trading port and a military bastion, it later became an industrial hub for textiles, shipping, cars, and now mobility services more generally, and pharmaceuticals. The history of Gothenburg, I would suggest, thus reflects the very idea of systems innovation. And it does so, I would argue, maybe better than any other place in Sweden. And I can illustrate that by the transition that started in the 70s, then in response to the energy crisis of that time, when the city managed to transform an industrial system based around ship production into an industrial system based around car production, thus avoided a lot of the severe downturns in employment we saw in other parts of Europe. And as part of this, we also moved very early with public investments to create an extremely efficient district energy system. The next wave when we did this was, of course, in the 80s and 90s, when the globalization really hit home, when we managed as a city to turn a largely domestic industrial production system into what I describe as a complex web of globalized value chains controlled from Gothenburg. And Volvo here is, of course, the most obvious example, taking in capital first through Ford from the US and later from China, while all the time, I would argue, preserving its strong local roots in Gothenburg. But also here in the 90s, an important part of the story again is a massive publicly led investment program in urban renewal, where what remained of the old shipyards were turned into a world-class innovation hub, now known as Lindholmen. And the success of this transformation is stunning. Gothenburg is now truly a city open to the world, as we name it. And it's arguably one of Europe's most important bridges to China. And now we're currently in the midst of the next transition, which is turning a very successful neo-industrial innovation hub, which is how I would describe Gothenburg today, into what we believe can be a pioneer in what I describe as a new transformative economy. Economy direct, not a limiting emissions, but to transforming the way that the global economy works. And the car industry is, of course, well on its way here, transforming mobility, both at the car level and at the systems level. And we now need to make sure we get the petrochemical industry along as well. But this will also, and this is an important part, require us again to come with the public investments and upgrade our energy and transportation system accordingly. But systems innovation in this sense is, I would argue, in the DNA of Gothenburg, and it accounts for its industrial historical success. It's just that we didn't talk about it very much, for better and worse, because we're busy big digging and rewiring and, of course, writing invoices. Having said that, some things are new this time around, and we need to appreciate that. And that, I think, makes this event important, and the new relationships that could come of it important. And key here is that the shift we're now in the midst of is moving much faster and involve a new level of risks compared to previous transitions. And it does it for two reasons. Firstly, the technological shift we're seeing is more fundamental. It goes deeper into the economic structure and technological base than what we have seen before. Secondly, global capital flows now both speed up this transition, but also add a new level of unpredictability. So both contribute to significantly raise risk level. And given this, I think this time around, it's not possible for a city like Gothenburg to manage this shift on its own. The capital movements are too big, the risks are too significant, and quite frankly, we need help. And to be practical, Gothenburg, like most of Europe, is still deeply embedded in the fossil economy, and let's not forget that. In our case, we have an international port, the largest in Scandinavia, which every year receives 10 million tons of crude oil, which is pumped up into 2 refineries, both foreign-owned, which produce the equivalent amount of diesel and petrol, which is then shipped back onto the international market or taken by railway or truck, about 1.5 million tons, or by land to petrol station in Western Sweden. And if nothing of this was exported, Gothenburg alone could meet all the fuel consumption needs in Sweden. Through wise investments in the 80s, the city now makes use of essentially all the surplus heat of this oil production, which is a success story, which means that Gothenburg has about a third of its heat coming from waste heat that would otherwise go missing. But what it also means, of course, is that the fossil economy still shapes the logistics system, both on land and on the seas, the energy system, and through the heating system, the fossil economy also shapes the housing and urban structures in the city. So that's the depth of the influence. We believe that we are in an excellent position now to leapfrog into a bio-based economy, where much of these industrial assets can be reused, and we will ship in forestry residue and not crude oil. And with the port and the city of Gothenburg could become an even more important logistical hub in a new bioeconomy. But we also realize that this transition will take tens of billions in private investments, in addition to many billions in public funds in an evolved transportation system, an evolved energy system, and an increased efficiency measures. And we realize that the kind of industrial transformation projects, which is what we're talking about, is not easy to get right, and that there are quite a few potholes to get stuck in. So in short, while innovation is important, this is not something to turn around through innovation alone in any simple sense. And this puts the focus on what I think is my key message today when I begin to round this off, which is that we need to complement the generic discussion about innovation with a much more practically oriented one. And one part of this is how to build the new public investment programs that can integrate municipal, regional, national, international risk-taking in ways that we haven't seen in the past. But maybe most importantly, we need to build a new kind of capacity that will allow us to manage and navigate the risks involved in this transition: financial, organizational, and of course also political risks. And again, it's not something that Gothenburg can do alone. And what we're going to need here is an even more tight and even more dynamic cooperation with the state. And I'm glad that Gothenburg is one of the cities that has signed a climate contract with 5 municipal or state agencies, which is a good start, but it's only a start. Because what we're talking about here are not municipal concerns. The future of Gothenburg is also, I would suggest, the future of the backbone of the Swedish industrial system. So to round off, the key question, I believe, is not a technical one about innovation. We largely know that stuff, I'm inclined to say. The key question is much more of an existential one about risk-taking, because people at many levels now must take decisions with a degree of uncertainty and risk that they have never, ever faced before. It's, I think, around this challenge, we need to come together and find new support structures. And arguably, if you give me another minute, will you?
Sorry.
No. Arguably, though, that does take us back to the poetry, but I'll leave that for another occasion. Thank you.
Carl, there's nothing better than leaving it with a cliffhanger.
Thank you, Carl.